Wait, who owns this? This is definitely not mine. Wow, everything looks so delicious. I can't wait to try it. You should definitely try the rice. I know you're having an affair.
Honey, it's not what you think.
Tell that to your new girlfriend.
I found the perfume bottle under my own passenger seat on a Tuesday morning, small and gold and completely unfamiliar. And by the time I finished cleaning out the rest of what that woman had left behind in my car, I understood that my marriage had already ended weeks before I found the proof of it. If you think this is simply a story about a wife who caught her husband's mistress's perfume and confronted him, stay with me, because what I found underneath that bottle, literally underneath it, tucked into the same pocket of my glove compartment, is the part of this story nobody in my family knows to this day. Before I tell you what that discovery actually cost my husband and what it ended up costing me too, let me ask you to subscribe, because the woman who left that bottle in my car did not do it by mistake, and once you understand why she really did it, you will never look at this story the same way again. My name is Ronke. I am 36 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed I was married to a good man having a difficult season. I want to start there with that belief because I think it matters for you to understand how completely I trusted my husband before any of this began, so that you can understand how completely that trust collapsed once it started coming apart. Segun and I married 11 years ago, when he was still building the construction and property development company that would over the next decade grow from a two-man operation running out of a rented office in Ikeja into a mid-sized firm handling contracts across Lagos and increasingly into Ogun State. I was there for the early years, the years that mattered most, when we were driving to sites together in a second-hand Toyota with a cracked dashboard, when I kept the company's books myself at our dining table because we could not yet afford to hire an accountant, when Segun used to call me his co-founder at family gatherings, half joking, though I always suspected he meant it more seriously than the joke let on. I remember in particular the year we won our first major contract, a small housing estate in Magodo that Segun had bid for against 3 larger, better-funded firms, staying up until 3 in the morning with him at that same dining table, recalculating figures by hand because we did not yet trust the accounting software he had just bought, both of us too excited and too terrified to sleep properly for a week after the contract was confirmed. Those were not easy years financially, but they were, I have come to understand looking back, some of the truest years of our marriage, because everything Segun and I built in that period, we built together, in full view of each other, with no room for either of us to hide anything meaningful from the other, simply because there was not enough money or complexity in our lives to hide behind. I gave up my own career in banking in our 5th year of marriage, not because Segun asked me to, but because the business had grown to a point where it genuinely needed someone it could trust completely, handling certain sensitive parts of it. And there was no one Segun trusted the way he trusted me. I managed payroll for the growing staff, reconciled contractor payments, and for several years held what amounted to a full financial picture of the company in my own head. A picture that, I would later understand, became less and less complete as the business grew large enough to require a real finance department, and as Segun, without any dramatic announcement, gradually stopped bringing certain decisions to me at all. We have 2 children, Damilare, who is 9, and Folake, who is 6, and I want you to understand that whatever I am about to tell you, our home before all of this was, by every visible measure, a happy one. We took the children to church every Sunday, we hosted extended family for Christmas without complaint, and Segun was, in the ways a wife notices most, attentive, remembered anniversaries, complimented my cooking even when I knew it did not deserve it, never once in 11 years raised his voice at me in front of our children. He coached Damilare's small football team on Saturday mornings when his schedule allowed it, and even when he didn't, he made a point of calling the coach afterward to hear how the match had gone, A small habit that always struck me at the time as evidence of a man who took fatherhood seriously, even under the pressure of a growing business. I tell you this not to make what follows more painful for you, though I know it will be, but because I need you to understand that the affair I am about to describe to you did not announce itself through obvious neglect or cruelty. It hid, patiently and skillfully, behind a marriage that still, on its surface, looked exactly like the one I had built with him from nothing. If anything had changed in those final months before I found the bottle, it was something so small I only recognized it afterwards. In hindsight, the way you recognize a season changing only once you are already standing in the cold of it. Segun had become slightly more careful about his phone, slightly quicker to step outside for calls he used to take openly at the dinner table, slightly more generous with small gifts that, at the time, I read simply as a successful man treating his wife well, rather than as the quiet currency of a guilty conscience. The car matters to this story, so let me tell you about the car specifically. It was a gift from Segun on my 34th birthday, a silver SUV he had registered entirely in my name, which he told me at the time was simply a tax arrangement recommended by his accountant, a way of keeping certain company assets separate from his personal ones, for reasons I did not understand and did not press him on, because I trusted, as I trusted almost everything about our finances by then, that he knew what he was doing. I want you to hold on to that detail because it becomes important later in a way that even I did not expect when I first tell you about it now. 8 months ago, Segun's own car, the black saloon he used for site visits and client meetings, went into the shop for what was supposed to be a routine service that turned into a 2-week engine repair after the mechanic found a fault none of us had anticipated. During that stretch, he asked to borrow mine, and I agreed without a second thought, because that is what 11 years of marriage teaches you to do. You share the resources of a life you built together, and you do not stand at the gate interrogating your own husband about why he needs your car when his own is being repaired. I want to pause here at the very beginning of this story, because I know some of you are already guessing exactly what I found, and I want you to hold that guess a little longer, because it is only half of what actually happened. If you have ever lent something you loved to someone you trusted and had it returned to you changed in a way you could not immediately name, stay with me and do not forget to subscribe, because the smallest object in this entire story, a bottle of perfume no bigger than my thumb, ended up unraveling something far larger than an affair. I got the car back after 11 days, not the 2 weeks originally quoted because Segun's mechanic finished early, and I remember feeling when he handed the keys back to me at the gate, a small, unremarkable gratitude, the kind you feel for the return of something ordinary you had not thought to miss while it was gone. He had even had it washed before returning it, which I remember commenting on approvingly at the time, telling him what a thoughtful gesture it was, not yet understanding that a freshly cleaned exterior can sit quite comfortably over an interior nobody thought carefully enough to check. It was 3 days later, cleaning the car myself on a Tuesday morning because the house help was away visiting her family, that I found the bottle. It had slid or been pushed deep enough under the passenger seat that it had lodged against the seat track, invisible unless you were on your knees with a torch, checking for the coin I had actually been looking for, the one Folake had dropped weeks earlier, and that had somehow started this entire excavation. I remember the particular ordinarity of that morning, the radio playing a Sunday service replay I was only half listening to, my knees pressed into the gravel of our driveway, my hand finally closing around something that was decidedly not a coin, and how my entire body went still the moment I registered its shape and weight in my palm, some animal part of me understanding what I was holding before my conscious mind had caught up to it.
It was a small gold bottle, a perfume brand I did not recognize immediately, elegant in a way that told me it was not cheap, half full, with a faint, distinct scent still clinging to the cap when I turned it over in my hand, something floral and warm, entirely unfamiliar, entirely not mine. I sat in my own driveway for what felt like a very long time, turning that bottle over and over, feeling something cold and certain settle into my stomach, even before my mind had fully caught up to what I was holding. I thought, absurdly, of a dozen innocent explanations before I allowed myself the obvious one. A colleague who had needed a lift somewhere, a relative I did not know about, anything except the plain truth that a woman had been sitting in that passenger seat long enough and comfortably enough to have something of her own slip loose beneath it. I did not confront Segun that same day. I want to be honest with you about that because I know some of you listening would have marched into the house immediately, and I understand that instinct completely. But I have learned, across 11 years of marriage, and particularly across the last difficult one, that the first thing a hot woman feels is rarely the wisest thing to act on immediately. Instead, I did something quieter and, I will admit, more calculating. I put the bottle back exactly where I found it, wedged against the seat track, and I began paying closer attention to details I had until that Tuesday allowed myself not to notice. The days that followed felt like living two separate lives inside the same body. I made breakfast for the children, drove them to school, sat across from Segun at dinner discussing ordinary things, a leaking pipe in the boys' quarters, Damilare's upcoming school play, whether we should repaint the sitting room before the holidays, all while carrying silently the knowledge of a small gold bottle sitting exactly where I had left it, waiting to become useful. I found myself studying Segun in a way I had not studied him in years, watching for the small tells a wife learns to read without ever being taught, a slightly longer pause before answering a simple question about his day, a phone kept face down on the arm of the sofa where it had always previously sat openly on the dining table, a new attentiveness toward me that felt unmistakably like the particular overcompensation of a guilty man rather than the ordinary kindness of a faithful one. The scent was the first thing that undid the last of my doubt. 2 weeks after finding the bottle, at a company dinner Segun's firm hosted for its senior staff and spouses, I caught the same floral warmth passing close behind me near the buffet table, and when I turned, I found myself face to face with a woman I had met perhaps 3 times before at similar functions, Toyin, the firm's finance officer, a woman in her early 30s with the kind of quiet, competent confidence that had always in the past made me admire her from a polite distance rather than suspect her of anything at all. She smiled at me that evening with a warmth that, looking back now, I understand was its own kind of performance, complimenting my dress, asking after the children by name in a way that felt at the time like simple professional courtesy from a woman who paid attention to details and that I would later understand had likely been rehearsed, at least in part, precisely because she knew exactly what she had left behind in my car 2 weeks earlier. I smiled back, giving away nothing, while every instinct in my body confirmed what the bottle perfume had already told me 3 weeks earlier. And I remember standing there at that buffet table, making small talk about a serving of jollof rice, aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was looking directly at the other half of whatever had happened in my own passenger seat. I want to pause here again because we are approaching the middle of this story, and what I found next changed the shape of everything I believed I understood about my own marriage. If a piece of this is reminding you of your own quiet noticing, your own bottle under a seat, or a similar small object that told you something before your husband ever did, do not forget to subscribe because the confrontation that followed was not the end of this story. It was only the beginning of the real one. I began, over the following weeks, doing something I am not proud of but do not regret. I started checking Segun's card statements, which I still had partial access to from my years managing the company's books, looking specifically on charges from the 11 days he had had my car. What I found was not simply evidence of an affair, though it was certainly that. 2 hotel charges at a mid-range establishment in Victoria Island, both on days he had told me he was at site inspections in Egbe. A restaurant bill for 2 on an evening he told me he was working late at the office. I remember sitting with my laptop at the same dining table where we had once recalculated contract figures by hand at 3 in the morning, cross-referencing dates against a calendar I kept in my head of everything Segun had told me about his movements over those 11 days, watching the story he had told me and the story the statement told me diverge, receipt by receipt, until there was no honest way left to reconcile them. It was methodical work, the kind of quiet, patient accounting I had once done gladly for a marriage I believed completely, and there was something devastating about realizing I still had the skill for it, still remembered exactly how to trace a paper trail to its source, except now the trail I was following led not toward the health of our shared business, but toward the precise architecture of my own betrayal. What I found alongside that evidence, buried in statements I would not have thought to examine so closely if the affair itself had not sent me looking, was something I did not expect at all. A pattern of transfers, small and irregular, and disguised under vague descriptions like materials advance and contractor float, moving out of the company's operational account and into a personal account I did not recognize. An account that, when I finally traced it through records I still fortunately had access to, belonged to Segun himself, separate from the joint account we had always used for family expenses. The transfers were not large individually, rarely more than 300,000 or 400,000 naira at a time, which I understood immediately was deliberate, the kind of restraint a person exercises specifically to stay beneath whatever threshold might trigger closer scrutiny from an accountant less familiar with the company's rhythms than I had once been. I confronted him on a Thursday evening, after the children had slept, laying the perfume bottle on the dining table between us, along with printed copies of the hotel receipts, and I watched my husband of 11 years go through every stage of denial I imagine any cornered person goes through. First confusion, feigned and unconvincing, then irritation, as though I was the one being unreasonable for asking, and finally, when I placed the bank statements beside the receipts, a stillness that told me more than any confession could have that I had found something even larger than I understood. I remember the particular silence of that room in the moment he saw the statements, a silence so complete that I could hear the ceiling fan turning overhead, and faintly, Folake's small voice through the baby monitor, murmuring something in her sleep, entirely unaware that the shape of her family was rearranging itself 2 rooms away. He admitted to the affair first because it was the smaller of the 2 things I had discovered, though he did not know that yet. He told me it had started 8 months ago, almost exactly when he first borrowed my car, that it had begun, he claimed, as something professional. Long hours at the office reviewing contracts, a shared bottle of wine after a difficult client meeting that had gone badly. I want to tell you honestly that I did not believe the innocence of that framing in the moment he offered it belonged in the moment he offered it, but I let him finish because I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I decided how to respond to it. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes without me interrupting him once, and I remember watching his hands as he talked, the same hands that had once counted coins with me at that same table in our earliest years, now gesturing through an explanation that felt with every sentence like a man trying to convince himself of a story rather than confess an honest one. It was when I placed the bank statement fully in front of him, sliding them across the table with a calm that frightened even me, that Segun's face changed in a way I had never seen in 11 years of marriage. He asked, his voice suddenly much quieter, where I had gotten those statements, and I told him the truth, that I still had access to records from the years I managed his books, that I had gone looking for evidence of an affair and found instead something that looked considerably more serious than a wandering husband. I watched something in him deflate at that moment, not the deflation of a man caught in infidelity, which I had already witnessed minutes earlier, but something closer to the deflation of a man realizing that a much larger structure he had built to hide something else entirely had just, without warning, been exposed to the one person he had never planned for it to reach. This is where the story becomes something I did not expect it to become when I first sat down at that dining table.
certain I was about to have a conversation about betrayal of the ordinary kind. Because what Segun told me next, haltingly, in pieces he seemed to be assembling for the first time even as he spoke them aloud, was that the affair with Toyin had not actually begun the way he first described it. Toyin, as the firm's finance officer, had discovered the irregular transfers herself months before the affair began, during a routine reconciliation she had not been specifically asked to perform. She had approached Segun privately, not as a colleague raising a concern through proper channels, but directly, quietly, giving him the chance to explain himself before she decided whether to take what she had found to the board. Segun told me that his first instinct when Toyin confronted him with what she had found was panic dressed up as charm, an attempt to explain the transfers as a temporary personal cash flow arrangement he intended to reverse before anyone noticed, an explanation he admitted, sitting across from me that Thursday night, he had never actually intended to make good on. Somewhere in the weeks of conversations that followed, conversations that started as damage control and gradually became something else, the line between managing Toyin's silence and genuinely wanting her company had blurred in a way he claimed, even then, he could not fully account for himself. I remember thinking, listening to him, that this was perhaps the most honest thing he said to me that entire evening, that even he did not fully understand anymore where the calculation had ended and the feeling had begun, and that the not knowing was in its own way a kind of confession. I asked him, my voice barely steady, whether the affair had started as some kind of arrangement, silence in exchange for something else, and he would not answer that directly, which told me, as it so often does, everything the silence itself was refusing to say. What he did tell me eventually, staring at the table rather than at me, was that the relationship had become genuinely complicated in ways he had not anticipated, that Toyin had not simply agreed to stay quiet in exchange for money or favor, but had over months of proximity and shared secrecy developed real feelings for him, feelings that had made her increasingly uncomfortable with what she knew, increasingly torn between loyalty to a man she had become involved with and the growing pressure of an internal audit the board had recently authorized, one which would within weeks expose the transfers regardless of anything either of them did to delay it. I want to pause here because this is the deepest layer of this story, the one I did not understand until weeks after that first confrontation, once I had time to piece together everything Segun told me that night against everything I learned afterward through people who still, fortunately, trusted me enough at his company to speak honestly. Toyin did not leave that perfume bottle in my car by accident. I want you to sit with that, because when I first found it, wedged against the seat track, I assumed I had simply caught the careless edge of an affair, a woman who had grown comfortable enough in another woman's car to forget something behind. That was never what happened. Toyin left that bottle deliberately, knowing precisely what it would lead me to find, because she had run out of ways to end something she no longer had the courage to end herself. I learned this most clearly from a conversation I had several weeks later with Toyin herself, a conversation neither of us particularly wanted, but one I insisted on because I needed to understand, for my own sake, exactly what had happened inside my marriage while I was raising 2 children and trusting a man I had built a company with from nothing. I reached out to her through a mutual acquaintance from the company dinner, and I was surprised, honestly, when she agreed to meet at all, though she later told me that she had been waiting for me to reach out, had in fact half expected it from the moment she chose to leave the bottle behind rather than simply dispose of it herself. Toyin told me, sitting across from me in a quiet cafe in Lekki, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she did not drink, that the board's internal audit had been closing in for over a month by the time she left that perfume bottle in my car. that she had watched Segun grow increasingly desperate, increasingly willing to ask her to help him hide the transfers more completely rather than come clean, and that she had understood with a clarity she said had frightened her, that she was about to become as complicit in outright fraud as Segun was already, unless something outside either of their control forced the whole arrangement into the open before the audit did it for them, more publicly and far more dangerously. She described in a voice that stayed carefully level throughout most of our conversation and cracked only once near the end, the particular exhaustion of the previous several weeks. Nights spent lying awake calculating exactly how much exposure she personally carried if the audit found what she already knew it would. Days spent performing normalcy at the office while quietly gathering in her own mind every version of an exit she could imagine, none of which felt survivable until the morning she realized the one exit that might actually work required her to stop protecting Segun and start, in her own words, protecting herself instead. She left the bottle knowing I cleaned that car most weeks, a detail she admitted she had picked up almost accidentally from an offhand comment Segun had made months earlier about how meticulous I was about the SUV he had bought me, a comment he likely intended as simple praise for his wife, and that Toyin had filed away without either of them realizing it at the time as exactly the kind of detail a desperate person eventually finds a use for. She left it wedged deliberately against the seat track rather than simply on the seat, where the house help might have found and discarded it without a second thought, precisely because she understood a searching woman would eventually find something pushed that far out of sight and would understand instinctively that it had been hidden, not simply dropped. She told me with what I believed, despite everything, was genuine remorse, that she was not proud of the position she had put herself in, the affair, or the silence around the fraud, but that by the time she understood how deep both had become, the only way out she could see that did not end in her ruin alongside Segun's was to let his wife discover it herself, in a way that could not be denied, negotiated, or quietly absorbed the way Segun had absorbed every other warning sign for months. I am not asking you to forgive me, she said to me near the end of that conversation, her voice finally breaking on the word forgive. I only wanted you to know it was not carelessness. I owed you that much at least, after everything else I could not give you. The internal audit, when it finally concluded 3 weeks after our confrontation, confirmed everything the bank statements had already shown me. Nearly 11 million naira diverted over 14 months, moved through invoices for materials that were never purchased and contractor floats for work that was never performed. Money that Segun had used, I discovered, with a particular bitter irony, to fund the very hotel meetings and gifts that had built his relationship with the woman who eventually exposed him. I remember reading the audit summary a family friend on the board quietly shared with me, line by line, recognizing entire categories of expense I myself had once approved in smaller, honest versions of the same line items years earlier, back when materials advanced meant exactly what it said and nothing sinister was hiding underneath the label. The board terminated him within the week. And though they chose, for reasons involving their own reputation more than any mercy toward him, the damage to his standing in Lagos's construction industry was, from what I have heard since, considerable and likely permanent. Word travels quickly in that world, I learned, even without a formal charge attached to it. Clients who had worked with Segun for years quietly redirected new contracts elsewhere. Business associates who had once called him a friend at industry functions grew suddenly difficult to reach. And within 2 months of his termination, the company itself, the one we had built together from a rented office and a cracked dashboard, had brought in an outside partner to stabilize its finances and reassure its remaining clients, a partner whose name now appears on correspondence where Segun's once did.
I filed for divorce 2 months after that first confrontation at the dining table, once I had gathered everything I needed to understand exactly what I was walking away from and exactly what I intended to keep. The process itself was mercifully faster than I expected, in part because Segun, facing the collapse of his professional reputation alongside his marriage, seemed to have little appetite left for prolonging a fight over assets when the larger fight for his standing in the industry was already lost. His lawyer raised objections in the early meetings out of professional obligation more than conviction, I suspected, and largely abandoned them once it became clear I was not interested in punitive demands beyond what I genuinely believed I was owed for 11 years of building something alongside him. The car, still registered entirely in my name from that birthday gift 3 years earlier, was never seriously in question, though Segun's lawyer made a half-hearted attempt to argue it should be considered a marital asset subject to division regardless of whose name appeared on the papers. I kept it, along with the family home, while Segun moved into a smaller flat in a part of Lagos considerably less prestigious than the neighborhood we had shared for most of our marriage. I want to tell you that keeping that car felt, at the time, like a small and almost absurd victory in the middle of a much larger devastation. And in many ways, it was exactly that, a silver SUV, still smelling faintly, no matter how many times I had it detailed, of a perfume that was never mine, sitting in my driveway as the one clean, undisputed thing I managed to walk away from a broken marriage still holding. I think now about the calculation Toyin must have made, sitting in my car with that bottle in her hand, deciding to leave behind the one piece of evidence that would end everything for both of them, rather than continue absorbing a secret that had grown too large and too dangerous to carry any further. I do not forgive her for the affair, and I do not think forgiveness is owed simply because her reasons for eventually exposing it turned out to be more complicated than jealousy or carelessness. But I understand her, in a way I did not expect to. Understand what it costs a person to realize they have become complicit in something they cannot undo, and to choose, finally, the only exit available to them, even when that exit requires detonating another woman's entire life to create it. Segun and I share custody of Damilare and Fodake now, an arrangement that took months of difficult negotiation to settle into something workable, something that does not ask our children to carry the weight of everything their father chose and everything I chose in response. Damilare, who is old enough to sense that something significant changed, even without understanding the specifics, has asked me twice why Daddy no longer works with the company, and both times I gave him an answer honest enough to satisfy a 9-year-old without burdening him with details he's not yet ready to hold. Folake, younger and mercifully more absorbed in her own small world, has adjusted with the particular resilience of a 6-year-old. Though she still asks some Fridays whether Daddy is coming for the weekend, in a tone that carries more hope than a divorced mother ever wants to hear in her daughter's voice. He has started over in a smaller way, I am told, consulting rather than running his own firm. The trust that took him a decade to build in that industry, gone in the space of a few months, the way trust so often is, slowly and then destroyed all at once the moment someone decides they are entitled to something they were never owed. I see him now only at the handovers, at school events we both attend separately but civilly, standing at opposite ends of a classroom or a football pitch, two people who once counted coins together at a dining table, now negotiating custody schedules through a mediator neither of us particularly likes, but both of us, at least, respect. I drive that car every day now, past the office where Segun's company used to operate before it quietly changed hands, past the restaurant where I once celebrated anniversaries with a man I genuinely believed was building something honest alongside me. Some mornings, dropping the children at school, I catch a trace of that floral scent still faintly present, despite every detailing appointment I have taken it to. And I no longer feel the cold, certain dread I felt the first Tuesday I found that bottle wedged against the seat track. I feel instead something closer to a strange, hard-won gratitude that a bottle so small could carry so much truth inside it, and that a woman I never asked to help me chose in the end to let me find it. I do not know where Toyin is now. She left the company shortly after the audit concluded, and I never asked to know more than that because I understood finally that whatever debt existed between us had been paid the moment she chose to hand me the proof instead of continuing to hide it. What I know instead is this. I built a business with a man for 11 years, and when it collapsed, what I walked away with was not the company, not the reputation, not even in the end, the marriage. What I walked away with was a car with my name on the papers, my children in the back seat most weekends, and a version of myself I had nearly forgotten existed under 11 years of trusting someone else with everything I had. If this story reached something true in you, subscribe, because the next time one of us finds a small, unfamiliar thing hidden somewhere it should not be, I promise you, we will tell you exactly what it cost us to go looking for the truth underneath it.